When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked, and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
Michael Ross is one of the most brutally sadistic serial killers the world has ever seen. But to most, his name remains virtually unknown.
Michael Ross killed 8 different women. He had actually sexually assaulted 7 of the 8, but killed all of them.
He was outwardly very respectable, had a decent job, even committed some of his offences whilst wearing a 3-piece suit.
He strikes me as an inadequate, sexually obsessed, deluded, obsessive-compulsive serial killer who killed primarily because of the extreme sexual excitation of the act of sex and killing.
Yet what makes Michael Ross unique amongst serial killers is how he turned himself in and was prepared to discuss his crimes in unparalleled detail, offering an insight into the mind of a serial killer, unlike anyone before or since.
I told her that if she didn't do what I wanted, that I would smash the baby's head against the wall of the house. I raped her, strangled her, and left her for dead.
This is the first in-depth study of the killer, who became known as the roadside strangler, and the first that tries to answer the question of what turned a seemingly mild-mannered insurance salesman into a monster. In 1984, Michael Ross was in prison in Connecticut, awaiting trial after the murder of 8 young women. He was almost certainly facing the death sentence for his crimes.
I used them, I degraded them for my own personal pleasure. When I was having problems with women, the pressure would build up. And then when I saw a woman in a vulnerable situation, that was the trigger, and that's when I killed.
Dr. Fred Berlin is one of the USA's leading forensic psychiatrists. He has worked extensively with the FBI on serial murder investigations and includes Jeffrey Dahmer amongst his most infamous past patients.
You would think that if you killed somebody, that you would have that face imprinted in your mind and that you wouldn't be able to get it out of your mind. I don't have that. I never had that.
Dr. Berlin was asked to assess Ross by the killer's defense counsel, but nothing in his long experience as a psychiatrist could have prepared him for the full extent Ross would allow the doctor to explore the dark cave of his psyche.
I stopped at the printing shop and picked up some printing stuff. I was on my way home. It was 3:30 in the afternoon on a fairly well-driven road. She was walking along the side of the road. I just stopped the car, went, raped her, and killed her.
This is the first time Dr. Berlin has heard the voice of Michael Ross since he last treated him as a patient in 2003.
Everybody's entitled to have their own defense. They're entitled to be seen by qualified experts. I don't try to help somebody win a case. I'm there to try to provide information to either a judge or a jury that hopefully they will find helpful in making a difficult decision. When I was first contacted by Mr. Ross's attorneys, I didn't know anything about the case. I'd never heard of him. One of the things that interested me early on is that he had simply been a suspect when the police had questioned him, and when they told him that he should confess if he was the killer for the sake of the victims, he actually did confess at that point and led them to the bodies, which I found to be a somewhat unusual circumstance.
I felt like I was on the edge, like I just felt like I was right on the edge, and like it wouldn't take much to push me over, and I was very frightening back then.
Ross's willingness to confess not only surprised Dr. Berlin, but also the seasoned detectives who questioned him. To begin with, they were all highly cautious to take anything he said as true, because serial killers are notorious for playing mind games with their interviewers.
When interviewing a person, certainly in the forensic setting, it's important always to look for some cross-reference checking, because some people have an interest in deceiving you, in portraying themselves in something of a light other than the truth. Other people can't portray themselves as they are. They have defenses, they have problems that mean they cannot tell you, so you have to help them to find ways around that. And in some ways, that conundrum is at the heart of the successful or the unsuccessful forensic interview.
As Dr. Berlin's interviews with Ross progressed, he was able to corroborate many of the things Ross had told the detectives, and was satisfied his patient was telling him the truth. But their conversations still held many challenges.
Initially, he seemed to be almost like a computer. In other words, he could provide me with information, but much of this was information about very emotional types of events. He'd killed people, there were victims, there was suffering, there was criminal activity, and yet he was just talking about it in a way that seemed very matter of fact. My initial impression was he was simply talking about this almost like he was in a third person, rather than speaking as someone who had taken the lives of 8 innocent people.
When I attacked her, I don't believe I was in control. I don't think I could have stopped. I didn't really feel anything. I mean, I knew what was going on. I saw what was going on, but it was more like watching an old film that we used to see as kids in the high school. They've been played so many times, they're all spliced, and it'd be going along and then jump. I'm not saying I wasn't there, it was a multi-personality or any of that kind of crap. I was there and I did it, but I wasn't 100% there.
Michael Ross was born in 1959 and raised on a working egg farm in Brooklyn, Connecticut. Dr. Berlin was interested to learn if Ross's formative years on the farm and his relationship with his parents may have held the key to explaining how he evolved into a serial killer.
He was very, very adamant that he did not want his mother in particular to be blamed for the things that he did. Again, he said he didn't have much memory of his childhood. He did not want to talk at all about his mother, particularly anything negative. I later found out through independent sources that his mother had likely had some form of mental illness, that she had treated him very badly, a lot of physical disciplining and so on. But Mr. Ross himself was very adamant that he did not want bad mothering to be blamed for what he had done, and really was very hesitant to say anything about his mother in particular.
His mother certainly had very marked mental health problems, and that can only have had an effect, really, well, given the nature of those mental health problems and what we know about the instability of the relationship with his mother. The mother is usually, not always, but usually the primary caregiver, the person with whom the child has most interaction in the early years. Those early years are when the person's crucial social development takes place. It's through feeling recognised, feeling responded to, feeling you matter, that a young child will develop the ability ultimately to see other people's perspectives or regulate and control his or her own conduct. Now, when that sort of process goes wrong, for example, if you've got a mother who is unresponsive or erratically responsive, well, it can create the context for problems later on. It doesn't cast things in tablets of stone, but all too often one set of disadvantages can lead to another, and so the person begins to develop in a more and more unusual and, well, antisocial kind of way.
Unable to form any consistent or fully loving bond with his parents, Michael threw himself into working on the family farm with them. At least working with them brought him a sense of proximity, if not the closeness that he longed for. But as much as he loved working on the farm, even as a boy he was given more and more duties. One job in particular that many would consider to be unsuitable for a child to perform. A job that may have given him his first pleasurable sensation in taking a life.
When he was just 8 years old, his uncle, thought to be interfering with Ross during babysitting times, committed suicide. And when the uncle died, there was a job vacancy for the person who had to kill the malformed chickens and the ones that were ill by manual strangulation.
Mr. Ross never made any excuses for his behavior or tried to explain it in terms of life experiences. In fact, he had very little memory of that. So he knew that he had strangled these chickens, but he really didn't have much memory of it. I simply recall thinking at the time that for a young child, 7, 8 years old, to be asked to do this is just not something that should be expected of any youngster that age.
I think if you had a person who had only experienced that, it would be unlikely that that would lead on to the killings that we look at later. If you look at what goes on today in battery farming, there are people whose task is to see unviable animals sent on from this world. They don't become serial killers. They become ordinary, well-balanced people.
Dr. Julian Boone is one of the country's leading forensic psychologists and has clinically assessed dozens of murderers in his long and esteemed career. He believes the killing of the birds is a chilling forewarning for what was to come in Ross's adult life.
It is far from unlikely, in my view, that he got excitement out of doing that at 8. So although he's in what Freudians would call the latency period, where sex takes a back seat, it doesn't prevent people who are between 5 and puberty getting excited by whatever, some things that cause them to be sexually excited. And if he was getting off on that, well, it's a hop, skip and a jump to gradually emerging to making strangulation his preferred thing that he gets sexual gratification from.
As his frustrations with farm life grew, Ross was about to find a new means of venting his anger. He was about to attempt to graduate from farm animals to human beings.
There is a clear thread between people who abuse physically, sometimes sexually, animals, and those that may then progress into causing injuries to humans. I mean, certainly there's a very clear association between people who abuse their domestic pets and those that abuse their children. And this is something we're trying to train the veterinary surgeons to understand, that if an animal comes in with repeated injuries, they need to tell the social services and warn them that the children may also be at risk. But there is a clear line between causing injury, maybe simply pulling the wings off butterflies, through injuring smaller mammals up, and it's a clear progression. It doesn't happen in every case, but it is certainly a clear sign.
Despite his disturbed upbringing, Ross excelled at school, and in 1977 he won a place at the prestigious Ivy League university, Cornell. But he looked old for his years, which immediately set him apart from the crowd, a problem only compounded by his increasingly detached persona. Despite joining many different clubs, he remained something of a loner, increasingly seeking solace in the fantasy side of his life.
The fantasy component of a serial killer's life can begin a long time before they actually take steps to fulfill it. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who never get past the fantasist stage. Their sex life is entirely fantastic in the sense that it's in their own mind and is satisfied by simple masturbation or something of that sort. But there are a few who need to take it that step further, and then those fantasies need to be transformed into some degree of reality.
He first had fantasies about kidnapping a woman or a girl and getting her to love him, and then ultimately they would get married.
Very quickly, those fantasies developed into something far more depraved, where the sexuality and the violence were fused together.
He was a bright boy, IQ of 122. He went to university to study, I think, agricultural economics, and was also working full-time on the farm so he could cope. Unintelligence was not the problem.
In his academic life and in other spheres of his life, he was probably quite successful. He was an intelligent, articulate young man. Unfortunately, he was academically successful, but he was, in terms of relationships, very unsuccessful. He had a very serious relationship. He thought they were going to marry. She was very important to him. I think he genuinely cared for her, but the relationship began to deteriorate. She was pregnant. She aborted that pregnancy. They eventually split up, and it was probably at her initiation. And I think that experience really damaged Ross, because I don't think he was a very robust, well-developed, confident individual.
The rejection by his girlfriend saw Ross retreat deeper into his fantasy world. But it would soon fail to satisfy him. Despite the dark and deadly nature of his thoughts, he was determined, like so many serial killers before him, to turn his fantasies into reality.
Ross was extremely sexually frustrated. He wasn't successful with women, and he was increasingly living in this fantasy world and drawing succor from it and drawing strength from it, to the point where he could begin to see himself successfully abducting and raping. And he really needed to do that now, because he was a full-blown obsessive compulsive.
In most cases of murders that are motivated by a sexual disorder, the reality is really an enactment of the fantasies. What the fantasies were for Mr. Ross were of grabbing and sexually assaulting an innocent woman. In his case, there were usually young females. The fantasy included, in conjunction with the sexual assault, strangling them, which would even further intensify his sexual excitement, and actually having them die. And again, part of the pathology of this disorder is that whereas most of us would be having empathy for what the victim is going through, these thoughts and fantasies and behaviors simply further intensified his sexual excitement.
He is not sexually competent. He is not sexually appreciated. His attempts to make contact with women are failures. Now, whatever the reason, this can build up as a sensation of rejection and loss of control. And then there's the overcompensation, where they seek to get that recognition and attacking people, and then having sex with them in that context is their way of satisfying that particular set of conflicts. And the problem often is that reality doesn't conform as well to their fantasies as they want. And having done it once, they feel they can refine the fantasies, refine their modus operandi, and do it again. And that's the start, that's the genesis of the serial killer.
By the summer of 1980, the fantasy world Ross inhabited was no longer enough to satisfy him. He was now ready to take his first tentative steps out of his fantasy world. He was about to become a stalker and start rehearsing for murder.
It was a clear progression with Ross. He started with very well-defined fantasies that escalated in terms of their levels of violence. He progressed from there very quickly to stalking women. So he went from fantasy to behaviour in a reasonably quick fashion. So from fantasy to behaviour to stalking, and then to rape very quickly, and then to rape murder. So all of that happened in a reasonably short space of time. So for him, the fantasies were never quite enough, and he kept refining them, and they got more and more severe.
Mr. Ross's crimes aren't planned in the way that a bank robber would sit down and think about it and design a careful plot in terms of what he was going to do. But that's not to say that there wasn't premeditation in the sense that he's responding to recurrent fantasies and urges and desires that are with him. And so these were with him, and he would talk about that most of the time. He would talk about trying to fight the urges. He would talk about trying to not leave home out of fear that he would act on them. But you can't not leave home, and then he would leave home, and eventually he might see an attractive woman in a vulnerable situation that would heighten the urges even further. There were times when he could fight that urge and not give in, and there were other times where ultimately he did give in.
Ross was by now looking for women on a daily basis, hunting them on campus, supermarkets, and local diners. Yet the stalking too was soon to escalate, with him finding his urges too great to simply hang back and watch.
Stalking is something that changes from just bumping into someone who you may find attractive, maybe in a travel to work, maybe at work, maybe in other social situation, to deliberately inserting yourself into that person's life by watching them, by making sure you're on the same bus, by making sure you're in the same cafe, to watching them from a distance. It feeds your fantasy. You know, it feeds the desire to actually make a permanent, proper contact with that person. And that's why stalking is potentially dangerous. There is that edge of reality component to it. And if it flips over from reality, i.e. this person is unattainable and has not noticed me, into fantasy, which means they have noticed me and they want to form a relationship with me, that's where things go wrong.
Offenders who begin by stalking are really starting to rehearse, in many respects, the way that the environment can help facilitate crimes before actually committing them. So although stalking's a crime, it's hands-off. There is no, it's just watching, it's observing, it's taking notice of everything that's going on.
Stalking doesn't invariably lead to killing. It can be an activity in its own right. It's something where sometimes they begin to refine the technique. And also, it can give some people an intense sense of, well, connection to the victim, but also a sense of being alive, that this is for real, they're actually doing something, it's not just thinking about something.
Ross's stalking behavior brought him an intimate knowledge of the Cornell College campus and surrounding towns. In doing so, he'd mapped out something all prospective serial killers require: a hunting ground. Dr. Samantha Landrigan is one of the UK's leading geographic profilers. She assists the police in murder cases by helping them create murder maps, maps which demonstrate how killers are creatures of habit and habitat. She believes the Cornell University campus provided the perfect hunting ground for Michael Ross.
The college campus for Ross was perfect because he wouldn't have looked out of place there, because he himself was a student, and at the same time he will have been surrounded by potentially suitable victims, young women who were going about their business, and many, many different potential opportunities or potential targets from which he could then select in terms of suitability. And of course, not every potential victim is going to be suitable, because that's all processed or perceived in the eyes of the offender. Many offenders are really specific about the type of victims that fulfills their fantasy. It may be the way they look or the way they move, any number of things. And so many will be passed over, but with such a large pool of potential victims, Ross was bound to be able to find those that fit particularly his fantasy.
This then elevated in his final year at university to following women and making them know that he was following them home and putting them in a state of fear. And that state of fear was an aphrodisiac to him, culminating in him taking his first plunge by having a rape on a girl, which he was not convicted for. And he says if I saw a vulnerable female, I would want to enact my fantasy. It does illustrate the power of fantasy. He said once the fantasy was there and the opportunity was there in his mind, then it was going to happen. I couldn't stop myself.
Fantasies almost always progress. And it's interesting that his fantasies when he was younger was getting off the farm, and then as puberty kicked in, as a sexual life kicked in, his fantasies developed that component too. And then, when it wasn't really fulfilled in his day-to-day life, he wasn't able to satisfy those sexual components. Normally, he built in death.
On the 12th of May 1981, Ross's murderous fantasies reached melting point, and he claimed his first victim, a young student called Jong Nok Tu. Murdered on campus and thrown off a bridge, her death was initially treated as suicide, but police soon realized that an outsider may have been involved. Having gotten away with murder for the remainder of his semester, Ross lay low. By the summer of 1981, he graduated from Cornell. He found work as an insurance salesman and hit the road, traveling interstate to sell his policies. In rapid sequence, he would kill 7 more young women, all in the brief space of 3 years. His MO was the same in all cases. They would be abducted, strangled, and left face down by the roadside. But Dr. Fred Berlin believes that while Ross's desire to kill was escalating wildly, it was a desire he fought to contain.
The first murder is the one that not only is horrible for the victim, but traumatic for the offender. Mr. Ross had, and I believe this to be true, fought these urges for a very long time. And then there came a time where he just gave in to the urge and killed. And he did talk about having succumbed to the urge and described what is just horrendous about how he had taken this person, moved them over to a secluded area, sexually assaulted them. He talked about turning the victim over on her stomach and strangling her from behind. So he was describing extremely gruesome detail. He also described being very upset with himself after that first murder. Again, he talked about this in other instances, promising himself he wouldn't do it again. But clearly, as in time his urges again re-intensified, he did repeat that pattern.
Life on the road as a salesman gave Ross the perfect cover for his killings. But despite traveling long distances, he chose his victims close to home.
Offenders do not travel very far from home to commit their crimes. We've demonstrated that time and time again. I studied over 150 serial killers from across the United States and the United Kingdom, and the average distance that they travelled to offend was around about 4 kilometres. So really, really local as many other types of offence. So this myth that serial killers roam across countries, leaving bodies here, there and everywhere is just not true, because like all of us, they are constrained by their everyday behaviour, if you like. They operate from a base just like we do, and our bases, we usually start our journeys of a morning from that base and we end our journeys of the evening at that base. And so most of what happens, offending or not, will happen reasonably close to home.
His modus operandi was very much that of the kind of opportunistic coward, in that he was hunting and trolling safe places where he could abduct women, young women, so that he could get away with it. So that's a classic aspect of serial killing as well. This kind of cowardly, premeditated stalking behavior where he maximizes the ability to escape.
The decisions offenders make are rational in that they will select particular locations based on risk and reward and effort involved. And when you have a dead body, there are not only risks, but there are significant logistical issues around transporting a body beyond a car. And often killers will utilise routes that they're familiar with, routes that they know they will be using subsequently, because it is all about reliving. It's similar to when an offender takes a souvenir from a body, if you like. If an offender is then re-travelling those routes, and they can almost instantly, it's a trigger for reimagining what actually occurred there.
The majority of Ross's offending took place along the highways of Connecticut. Ross successfully abducted and murdered 8 young women, all in a period of 3 years. Every one of these women was left strangled and face down. By 1983, the Connecticut State Police knew that they had a serial killer on their hands. But Michael Ross continued to elude capture, even though as a murderer he had a very definite calling card, which police and criminologists referred to as a signature. Dr. Richard Shepherd was the UK's leading forensic pathologist. He is reviewing an audio clip of Ross, wherein the killer discusses his reasons for killing his victims via strangulation, perhaps the most intimate form of killing there is.
My biggest thrill sexually is from thoughts of strangling a woman. When I first came up here, I would relive the murders, the young girls that I killed. I would relive them multiple times a day, at least 2, 3. And on bad times, this is kind of a cyclical thing. There'd be periods of time, I'm talking over weeks now, where I would masturbate to these thoughts to the point of actually having sores on myself.
Strangulation is much faster than everyone thinks it's going to be. And one of the things we know is using people who have strangled themselves using a ligature in sexual paraphilias. And we know that the people in those cases usually become unconscious within about 15 to 20 seconds. So it's that quick. And death will follow quite quickly after that. If we transpose that to a manual strangulation, my guess is that, you don't have long periods of struggling and fighting in reality. But of course, what he perceives is a totally different thing. We all know that time is an elastic thing. Sometimes time can be immensely long, and sometimes it can be short. So my guess is his perception of the time it took to strangle them is actually wrong, but his memory of it, his internal memory, is correct. He thinks it took a long time, but in fact it didn't.
Ross himself, however, lost in the frenzy of murder, believed in his mind that strangulation was a protracted experience.
He said most people watch television and think, oh, it's just up to 5 minutes and that's all there is to it. In fact, it goes on for about 20 to 30 minutes or more sometimes. And he says, and that's an additional thrill. So it's long and it's manual and you get the feel of the person dying. And so it reifies and makes it more sensational, more direct than a quick knife job.
It was the killing that he said he enjoyed most. That was the thrill for him. But he was also sexually obsessed, and he was probably masturbating over these imageries long before he carried them out, and then subsequently having killed these women, raped and killed these women, he was continuing to fantasize, but he didn't have to fantasize anymore because he had the pornographic experience in his mind that he could live over and over again and masturbate to.
By 1984, Michael Ross had already taken 5 young lives. But in the April of that year, his killing was about to escalate. Whilst driving home from work, he came across 2 teenagers, April Brunet and Leslie Shelley. This is Ross describing the terrifying encounter in his own words.
I picked them up. They wanted me to drop them off at a gas station. I drove right by the gas station. One of them pulled a knife on me. And I don't know what I said, but I said something and she gave the knife to me. I obviously scared her. Took them to a place, tied them up. I put the younger girl, Leslie Shelley, into the trunk of the car. And I took the other girl, April Brunet, out and I raped her and killed her. Leslie Shelley has always bothered me more than the others. I think it was because she was so small. I think it was because she was so cooperative. And I think it was because the way she was killed was so close to the fantasy. It was like it was a fantasy.
Just a few months later, Ross would claim his final victim, a young woman by the name of Wendy Baribeau. Once again, she would be claimed from one of his highway pit stops.
His last crime is particularly significant in terms of the decision he made around the extent to which he went to conceal his victim's body. He buried his last victim under a stone wall and he encountered her opportunistically when he was driving home from one of his insurance appointments, committed the crime. But I think because he was so close to home, I think he was within about 3 miles of home, there was a hypothesis from the police at the time that perhaps The fact that he went to some lengths to conceal where the body was and actually bury it, that location may be particularly pertinent and important to the offender, i.e. revealing about where he might be living, and that indeed was the case. And the apartment where he was living was really at the geographic centre of his offending and very close to that last crime scene.
The fact that he used to dump his victims at the roadside and drive up and down does suggest that well, he was trying to derive the maximum benefit from having killed. Maybe it was something that enhanced his sense of control, almost of achievement. Another person successfully killed, and also, of course, he hadn't been caught. Maybe it's almost sort of flaunting, reveling in the fact that he's got away with this with impunity.
After the murder of Wendy, police were on the lookout for all owners of a blue Toyota vehicle that had been spotted near the scene of this young woman's disappearance. As the owner of such a vehicle, Ross went into a police station for routine questioning about the matter. But he stunned police officers present by instantly confessing to her murder and that of 7 other women.
As I recall, when Mr. Ross had spoken to the police, he led them to the bodies they might not otherwise have found. And he also described to them how he had hidden the bodies.
During the interviews, Ross spoke candidly about his crimes, offering a unique insight into the dark mind of a murderer.
He is a rare example of someone who is completely honest about what he was getting out of it, how he was mastered by his fantasies, by sexual arousal that came with his fantasies, the progression of the fantasies, and he was very lucid in being able to describe how they developed, why he got excited by the sight of young women who were vulnerable. That was a turn-on for him. The sense that they were in complete thrall to his control was something which he found sexually exciting.
When I was in college, that's when my rape fantasies first started. I started following women home, and I would get a thrill by them knowing that I was following them, that they would be scared, and that gave me a thrill.
He was even able to discuss honestly how he felt after having committed these rapes and murders.
After they were dead, I remember the very first feeling I had was my heart was really pounding. I mean, it was really pounding. The second feeling I had was that my hands hurt from where I had strangled them. And then the third feeling I had was fear.
During his time in prison, Ross corresponded with Dr. Berlin. The psychiatrist believes the letters Ross wrote displayed a growing sense of remorse for his crimes and an empathy for his victims.
Of course, I shouldn't complain. What I did in reality really isn't much better than what I've supposedly done in fiction. And to make things worse, rather than being remorseful for what I've done, I relive the acts nightly for my pleasure. And I fantasize about things I should have done during the acts, which would have generated even more pleasure. It's not enough that I've killed them. No, it's not enough I have to desecrate their deaths by fantasizing about the things that I should have done. That's a paragraph of how he's kind of deploring himself for the fact that he, instead of feeling remorse, which he knows he should feel, at that point is just preoccupied with these sadistic sexual fantasies and urges, and that he can't stop getting pleasure out of them.
The publication of the letters brought Ross to wider public attention, an attention which he seemed to enjoy, and perhaps also continued to allow him to indulge his fantasies.
I get mail coming out everywhere. It's nothing but mail, all over the place.
I think he had gotten to the stage in his serial killing where it was now public, and like many serial killers, he was actually enjoying the notoriety. When he's filmed in prison, you can see him smiling and talking about his life in prison. He talked about killing himself. There were a number of futile attempts at suicide. Now, my experience is that men in prison, if they decide to kill themselves, more often than not, they're successful. These gestures of suicide attempts are attention-seeking, inadequate behavior, and Ross was very good at that. I don't think he ever intended to kill himself. But he also talked about wanting to be chemically castrated or castrated literally because of this terrible, unrequitable sexual urge he had. But I'm not convinced that he would have wanted to have been castrated, because I still think he was enjoying, perversely, the sex of reliving his crimes.
The typical serial killer has a fantasy. They act it out, but the acting out doesn't quite fill the fantasy, so they modify it and do it again, and then they relive it and enjoy it, and then they modify it and do it again. It is an entirely fantasist life. And that's what he was doing. He was in front of the cameras. He was living out all those murders again and again and again. He used the interview that we've seen in order to fulfill his fantasies in public for the last time.
In 1987, Ross stood guilty as charged with the murder of 4 young women, although he admitted to all 8 murders. He was denied the show trial that most serial killers have, which is one of the reasons he's so little known to the wider public. Given a death sentence, he refused all offers of clemency. He tried to spend his time on death row, creating an image that he wanted the world to remember. He's displaying one of the rarer traits of a serial killer. Until the very end of his life, he wanted to redeem himself and be absolved for his crimes.
Redemption narratives are often a feature of offenders who give up offending. It's as if part of Ross, particularly during his time inside prison, was almost trying on aspects of a redemption narrative.
He knew he had to express remorse. Now, one of the things that he had twigged, talking to psychologists, talking to police officers, talking to the court, I don't know, he realized that he had to express remorse because that was the done thing. And that's what he was doing it and why he was doing it. But the bottom line was when he says, I felt nothing. That's the real Ross. That is the psychopath Ross with no association or link with humanity.
He wanted to waive his right to a reprieve from execution. And after he died, one of the psychiatrists who tried to insist he was mentally unfit to take that decision and should be kept alive, one of the psychiatrists received a letter from him. He said, "Checkmate, you never had any chance."
Ross's confession saw him held in custody, which is where psychiatrist Dr. Berlin first met him. Despite the severity of his crimes, does the willingness of Ross to admit to them, as he said, to spare any suffering to the victims' families, mean that he can truly be categorized as a monster?
I'm always concerned in society when we demonize or label other human beings. I've come to learn over time that the people that I interview who have done bad things, metaphorically speaking, have a broken mind in need of repair, that there is a legitimate mental health issue. They're not just evil people who don't care and are doing things with disrespect or disconcern for others. So I think it's that knowledge that's helped me see the humanity and hopefully the ability to look at this objectively, not losing track of the harm they've caused, but also not losing track of the fact that there may be other factors that need to be looked at and that are still very legitimate. If all we do with someone like Michael Ross is send him to prison, there's nothing about prison that can erase these abnormal sexual urges or that can enhance a person's capacity to successfully resist acting upon them. That requires a treatment component. And so if we're just going to get angry and outraged, that's completely understandable. It doesn't solve the problem. I'm hoping that through science and medicine and education, we can learn how to solve the problem. And if we can do that, we're all going to be better off as a consequence.